Session, Winning with the Internet of Things. In my day job, I'm the VP and Principal Analyst at Forrester Research on the CIO team focused on the Internet of Things. Our moderator today is Dr. Barbara Wixom. She's Principal Research Scientist at the MIT Sloan Center for Information Systems Research, or as the MIT people keep saying, CISR, C-I-S-R. Barbara brings deep academic and practical experience in data management, business intelligence, and analytics. She has authored 2 books on systems analysis and design, published by John Wiley & Sons. I'd like to remind you to please add your questions for the panel in the Slido app or on the Slido webpage, both of which work equally well. And be sure to upvote the questions that you'd like to see the panel answer, and I will signal those to Barbara. So, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Barbara Wixom.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, everyone. This is very exciting to be here to talk about the Internet of Things, another hot tech topic that MIT is exploring right now. For those not familiar with CISR, we were established in 1974 as a nonprofit out of Sloan to help organizations succeed in digitization. And one of the ways we do that is to dispel myths. So last year, I led a study to understand what really is going on with IoT. How do organizations get value? Let's clear some of that hype away and understand so that we can really move forward in effective ways. Now, I'm curious, with a show of hands, how many of you right now have deployed IoT implementations? Deployed. Quite a number. Okay, let's say maybe a third or so. How many of you are experimenting? You have proof of concepts, experimentation, pilots, prototypes. How many? Show of hands? Okay. And then how many of you are really not interested at all in IoT and are in the wrong place? Okay, all right. Not so many, that's good to know. So let me share what we found. We did see last year that IoT is emergent. First, it was hard to find IoT efforts. We were looking for leaders, managers, sponsors, or champions of IoT efforts. And I ended up successfully identifying 227 of these people. So smaller than we would have liked, but we did realize answers from 227 folks. And of those implementations, 52% were launched into the marketplace, delivering value, just to give a sense for what we found. Before we launched a survey, we conducted some interviews and we did some case studies to understand in depth where organizations were in their journey. And then we relied on survey data to understand some patterns and trends. And what I want to share with you today are some early findings. The report coming off of this study is in production, literally. If you are a CISR sponsor, this will be available next week. For the public at large, we will have a released report for everyone in 90 days. And if you completed the survey, you will get a personal email from me as soon as this report is ready with profuse thank you for participating. But here's what we found. First of all, we wanted to understand the scope of IoT, of what was happening. And we learned that there were these 3 phases as organizations were moving forward with the Internet of Things. The first phase had to do with getting ready. And the getting ready phase was laying very standard digital foundations that we would lay for any type of digital technology, social, mobile, Internet of Things. So for instance, firms were really focused on laying operational backbone capabilities, which would be the core processes of the firms and platforms that helped them, such as master data management and data governance and data quality types of programs. They were also very anxiously and quickly putting in place digital services platforms, which would include things like APIs and cloud and other types of capabilities that lets us deliver digital types of technologies quickly and deploy to the marketplace. And so again, this first phase, we were really focused on digital. But then to get set for IoT, there were some IoT-specific capabilities that organizations were working on. For instance, a set of edge analytics capabilities. We needed capabilities to understand how to do decisioning at devices, for instance, or how to do automated response or real-time types of response. So there was a set of capabilities for that. And then finally, to go with IoT, this really meant business change. We had to change as organizations to realize the value from IoT, and the changes that were possible were quite varied. Business change included everything from acting in proactive ways or acting in real-time ways, all the way through to understanding customers in new ways and engaging with them differently. And so this was really what we saw organizations concentrating on as they were moving their IoT efforts forward. Now, what's interesting is we noticed that there was an importance of the way in which you built these capabilities. And the way in which you built the capabilities really depended on the course you were going to take. And we saw two courses that organizations were pursuing. We saw one course that was around creating operational efficiencies in the firm. So one course was all about using IoT to improve inside the organization. The second course was about using IoT to achieve market effectiveness. And in this course, we were really excited about creating new types of enriched products using IoT analytics and data, creating customer experiences, delivering new types of analytics services based on IoT. Now, it was important, we found in the survey, to understand which course you were pursuing. And what the report will detail is how the capabilities differed based on where you're heading. So there were different capabilities you would need to bring to the table when pursuing operational effectiveness versus if you were going for, or operational efficiency versus pursuing market effectiveness. We also found that different types of partnering patterns were required. So for instance, if you were pursuing operational efficiency, it was really important as a firm to partner internally with your operations business unit, externally with data aggregators. Whereas for market effectiveness, you really needed to have your customer experience business unit, marketing, sales, and product on board, and you needed to have heavy customer involvement as examples. And so again, we'll have a report that details a lot more of the capabilities required to help you succeed in the various courses. But I did want to show you that this matters because the outcomes differed based on how well the capabilities synced with your goals. And so organizations pursuing operational efficiencies who put specific operational efficiency capabilities in place, they achieved higher returns in the bottom line of their organization. Whereas for market effectiveness, because of the focus they placed, the commitment they placed on putting the right capabilities that fit with their goals, then we're seeing greater sales, greater prices, all types of top-line growth for those particular organizations. All right. So this gives you a sense for, in a generalized way, what's going on with IoT. But what I'm really excited to do today is to introduce our panelists, where we can go deep dive into what's really going on in organizations and to give us some detail. So I'd like to ask my four panelists to please come up and join me. And what's nice, we have two perspectives that are going to give us deep understanding or a lot of information about transforming an organization, and then two perspectives on transforming many organizations. So welcome, gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Ed, why don't we start with you? And what I'll ask is each of you to introduce yourself and tell us about how the Internet of Things is creating value in your organizations, because I suspect the value creation is going to vary based on your different perspectives.
Perfect. Thank you, Barb, and thanks for having me here. My name is Ed Abbo, and I'm the CTO for C3 IoT. C3 IoT is a software provider. We provide a platform as a service for next generation applications. The idea is, how do we scale IoT and AI applications across an enterprise? As Barb has pointed out, and I'd say Michael Porter in his research has done, companies don't want to just deploy one or two of these applications. They actually want to deploy tens or hundreds of these apps. And so what we have done is basically recognize that there's a step function change in application development. And so now we have to consider distributed computing as a new platform. We have to take into account sensor and actuator information. And we have to bring in machine learning and AI into this next generation of applications. And so what we also recognized when we started the company in 2009 is that companies are struggling with these new architectures. And so they're struggling to build applications with distributed compute technologies, machine learning, et cetera. And we basically took a fundamentally different approach. We abstracted those technologies into a platform and abstracted 50, 60 different underlying components into a unified, cohesive platform so that our customers could actually rapidly design and develop these applications. And one example that was actually a finalist here for the CIO Award is NL. And if you heard the CIO at NL, they basically have a great IoT landscape, if you will. So they have 65 million customer endpoints. 2/3 of those are actually sensors, so the smart meters that record data every 15 minutes. So that's 1 million meter messages per second from their IoT infrastructure, a fully automated network, 2 million kilometers of power distribution network that's fully automated with sensors on it. And what we do for them is ingest the data from the sensor network, correlate it with 15 other different systems. So these are maintenance systems, supervisory control systems, weather data, et cetera, and apply machine learning on top of that data to essentially pinpoint fraud. So that's like, who's stealing power? Who's stealing? When did they start? How are they doing it? How much they've stolen? And then basically addressing reliability of the network. So essentially across 25-kilometer, 50-kilometer circuits, pinpointing where the circuit's likely to fail, which protection island's likely to fail over the next 30 days, so they can dispatch somebody to fix it before the lights go out. So that's an example of a petascale system, IoT and machine learning system deployed. We're now engaged in discrete manufacturing with 23 petabyte system across customer, dealer, manufacturing, all the way through supply, integrating, correlating those data so we can basically say if a part looks defective, which customer products are likely to fail so we can go fix them. So this is kind of looking across the entire value chain to deliver value, and the same thing in healthcare. We're taking records from 120 million patients or members and essentially correlating those data. Those are prescription data, diagnosis, procedures, medical records, and pinpointing in one case, who's likely to be dependent on opioids if we prescribe them a painkiller. And that's, for them, one of 1,000 applications and services they're looking to deploy.
So Ed, I know you mentioned predictive failure, and I think that might resonate with Marc at Tetrapack, or in terms of one of the applications. So Marc, why don't you talk about what's happening at Tetrapack?
So my name is Marc Meyer. I'm the CIO at Tetrapack. Tetrapack is a liquid food packaging company. We are in the processing business, where if you say dairy is one of the big customers for us, processing raw milk so it's ready to package, selling the equipment that is the packaging machine, selling the paper or the carton, packaging material, as well as then, of course, the service business on the end. We're a 60-year-old family company that just dominated in this space for many years. Anybody from Europe here knows us quite well. Here in the U.S., you find almond milk and juice boxes with the straw on the side, muscle milk, things like that in our package. So, as an industrial company, the big name of the game was to expand and get into every market. And for years, that meant, as far as we were concerned, you could pretty much give everything away except for the packaging material, because that's the consumable and that drives the business. But as we've reached out and we've gotten to these places, and there are more competitors out there, there was an understanding that every part of the business needed to be competitive. And the one that is of relevant for today is really in the service business, with literally thousands of customers all across the globe. For years in our packaging machines, we had sensors, but that was mostly to monitor and understand what was going on locally, the health of the machine, and also to give feedback to the field service engineers that were out there. Then the next step in our journey was to understand, well, we should, I say collect that data, but I say it in a very rudimentary sense. We should go around and pick up that data and take a look at it, because it would give us a tremendous base upon which to understand how our equipment is functioning, how we can improve the way we develop. When it comes to IoT, what IoT brought to it is, well, but why aren't we doing that real time? We're in all of these locations. We have this equipment. It's running. We can start talking about predictive maintenance and ultimately machine learning. So we had a good start in the sense that probably some 6,000 of 10,000 lines were already connected in the sense that they were accumulating data that we could get at. The next step was then to bring that somehow in. And that's when that was the first time, I guess, we realized that we needed to partner with somebody, because our customers are anywhere and everywhere. And the infrastructure around collecting and managing that volume of data was something that was going to be outside of what our IT organization would be. It wasn't too long ago we now publicly announced that we're working together with Microsoft and the Microsoft Cloud as the host to bring that in. But the idea is then now to real-time be able to monitor as well as collect that data in order to understand and drive a condition-based monitoring service, a predictive maintenance service, and even ultimately, once we understand more of what's in there, sort of a expert service or best practice service, because now we can also benchmark and we understand how one set of customers is performing compared to another, and the use cases can spin off from there. The key really though is that those first steps of getting access to that data in a way that you can use it to start then developing the cases.
Great, thank you, Mark. Michael, why don't you introduce yourself, but then same journey, different journey than Tetrapack?
Yeah, Michael Nilles, Chief Digital Officer of Schindler. I'm sure you have used our equipment, maybe some of you even today, elevators, escalators, very traditional business. I think we went in, to one extent, through a similar journey, and that was really when we, about 5-6 years ago, thought about what could be disrupting our business. So we are having, on the one hand, the new equipment business, so you are manufacturing, engineering, installing new machinery for your customers. On the other hand, we have the service business. And so it was quite clear that they could be not our existing competitors, but a new disruptive competitor come into the market and just offer service dispatching over a platform. So that was really when we started really big on the IoT journey. So classical, similar journey, industrial internet. We have first tried to do it by ourselves, which of course didn't really work that well. But 5 years ago, there was also no turnkey solution. Then we Went with some major partners. GE is one of our huge partners in this, where we also learned a lot, because it's not only about technology, but also making use of the data and monetizing it. But then I think what was quite different, we then figured out by switching from a more defensive strategy, defending our core business, that there is a great opportunity to also grow the top line. And this is maybe a little bit different from Tetrapack, because we have also passengers. So we have 1 billion people which we move every day on our equipment, and that's what we call the industrial user internet. We consider that the next phase after the industrial internet. We fully leverage our current platform, a digital industrial platform, but we have extended it towards what we call smart urban mobility, so that we are really able to monetize it. And so for us, it has really become a way of generating new business, a complete new business model, and really growing the top line. So for sure, the industrial internet play with predictive maintenance and so on is giving us a great advantage, no question about that. Also resulting benefits for the customers, like uptime, reliability, or better insights. But the huge play for us is really targeting new personalized services which are now able to address the industrial user internet with more than 1 billion new customers, so to say.
So question for both of you, and then we'll get to Jim, about this idea of what I was describing before of the internal versus external focus. Do you see this in any way as evolutionary? So for instance, could you create the market-facing services from the outset potentially, given the right capabilities? Or do you have to learn first inside the organization? What's your take on this? We're trying to understand how much, how big a course an organization can take with IoT. What's your sense?
I heard one thing that we both did. We both tried to do something first in the beginning, and then realized we needed to partner. But I think that made us actually a better customer to our partner, because we knew what it was we were asking for. I think it would be quite difficult if we had done nothing in the space to understand what there was. Because in the end, you're the domain expert of what you're going to try to achieve. Then I think the windows can open up and be quite broad. But we had one problem in particular we wanted to solve. For us, operational performance is one piece, but milk doesn't wait. So if the machine is down, the cow continues to produce, and it becomes waste. So there's also a big thing. So it's still on the same side of it, but it was in there. That was enough to drive to get it going, and it's a good pitch to the customer about why we can do it better. And then that leads to many open doors. What else we could do? That's my.
I have to say, really, I think IoT is it's a much bigger journey. So, and it ultimately will result into focusing on the top line growth, because we have done, let's say, all the internal optimization for quite some time. We just phrased it differently, right? We called it machine to machine, remote monitoring, whatsoever. IoT helped us then to really go big for it in terms of scale and in terms of scope. And I think ultimately on this journey, you then realize that the customer is having a substantial additional value and is also willing to pay for it. So you start to understand your data better, what assets they bring to the table, so that you can really start to develop a more comprehensive business model. And ultimately, you can then really think about developing a complete new business based on it. So IoT, I think, for industrial companies, and GE, one of, again, our biggest partners where we learned a lot from, is basically going the same journey. And so it's maybe good to start with the internal focus, but I think you very, very quickly have to then also start to look into how can you monetize data, how can you go into the external view. Otherwise, you will also lose, let's say, you will lose the traction within the company as well.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Jim?
Sure. So my name's Jim Poole. I'm the Vice President for Ecosystem Development at Equinix. And Equinix is the world's largest multi-tenant data center and interconnection company. So what that translates down to is we run 180 data centers in 44 metro markets in most of the major regions of the world. And inside of that infrastructure, we connect lots of service providers to each other within a value chain. So to the tune of, I think right at this point, we're roughly at about 230,000 interconnect. So the good example there would be if I'm Netflix and I want to distribute content, Netflix sits in our building, Netflix then connects to all the networks, right? So if you then take that and move it into the IoT space, the way I always tend to try to describe this to people in terms of how we provide value is there's sort of two basic business problems that we see people dealing with on a fairly regular basis. One is a physics problem. You can't fight physics. Speed of light is the speed of light no matter what you do. And data gravity is real, right? So these things matter. In the 3 V's, I always like to say that velocity, volume, and variety are the problems that we solve for. Because where does the data come from? It comes from everywhere. There is no such thing as one network that delivers you all your data. Usually you have multiple network providers in many IoT solutions. Sort of number two, where's it going to go? And in almost all implementations that we see, there is some form of cloud interactivity going on with that information. And so most of the major cloud platforms, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, all of their IoT offerings, the gateway infrastructure for those services sit in our sites. And then the final would be that sort of that scale issue around data gravity. There is no such thing as one giant data lake. It doesn't work that way. Generally, people and many of our customers, you'll see them stage data, just depending on the extent of their business, in up to 20 different markets around the world as they tend to start to scale out their infrastructure. So we see both sides of the equation. One is the service provider side. Many of the big service providers, I mentioned the 3 big cloud guys, but also, for instance, the GE Predix platform is hosted out of our facilities as well. The long tail of cloud providers, we have over 800 pure play cloud providers that do various different things, IoT being sort of one of the specializations. But to give you an example of the other side, the enterprise, the consumer side of the equation, usually one of the biggest problems people have when we see them is sort of step one, and it had to do with your foundational aspect. How do you get ready? And they're usually dealing with a couple of things. One, the network they have isn't the network they need, and they need to basically position themselves to use cloud. So I'll give you an example of, we have a very large tractor manufacturer. Can't mention them by name, but I'm sure you could probably figure it out. They do mining equipment all over the world. So, an average tractor in a mining site has 2,300 sensors. So you can imagine the amount of data that throws off. And so the data aggregation and collection aspect of that, they were doing that on a flat MPLS network, paying north of $80 a meg, not necessarily something that was going to scale out for the volume of data they were trying to collect. So we worked on with them first to do network transformation. How do you make the network more affordable and scale better? And one of the ways is doing that is, create an Ethernet backbone, right? Get rid of MPLS or regionalize your MPLS network, and brought the average cost down that they paid per megabit quite a bit, like orders of magnitude lower. And then the second thing was they needed to be able to process the data, but they had data sovereignty and ownership concerns, and so they wanted to be able to hold that data on their own metal, on their own platforms. And so their deployment architecture in those sites where they built that backbone was essentially to put NetApp or EMC sort of storage gear that then connected to a public cloud provider. So they would run the workload in the cloud, but the data never stayed in the cloud. And that afforded them flexibility as far as the other sorts of platform users. So that's usually the second problem that we see, which is essentially value chain integration. So no IoT project that I've seen to date has less than 20 different tech vendors involved at some aspect of what they do. And increasingly, those vendors are delivering what they do as a service. So in addition to this giant data collection, storage, aggregation process that you have to deal with, then you have to deal with the parts of that come from somebody else. And you've got to basically ping pong data across potentially multiple different vendors. So that's what we do.
Yeah, so this theme of partnering didn't just come out strongly across the panelists, but it also came out very strongly in our survey study. In fact, if you looked across all the organizations, every organization is partnering, to your point, with many, many tech vendors, different types, whether it be network providers or device manufacturers and such, but then also innovation partners, whether they be startups or academia or consultants or some other type of organizations to help through innovation. So let's just hit this first, because clearly this is key for IoT. And so my questions to the panel are two questions, two parts. One is, what's the hardest part about all this partnering, and then what has worked best for you? What's the one practice that has really been helpful in making sure your partnerships are effective, and on both sides, both the, the organization, the enterprise, as well as those serving enterprises. So who wants to start? Want to start, Ed?
I agree that you do require some partnerships, but I don't count 23. So I don't mean to be controversial there, Jim, but I don't. For our projects, we have maybe 3 or 4. There's the cloud provider, then there's connectivity to the endpoints for sure. But then the problem becomes a data integration problem, because the data points from these sensors themselves are interesting but not particularly useful unless you contextualize them with data from the rest of the enterprise. So, examples are, when was the equipment maintained, what conditions has it been under, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, there's a, in my opinion, actually a very pretty small data integration, and then you get on with data science and defining the problem.
So you don't see the challenges around the partnering itself. How about the rest of you? Are you finding this to be the case, or?
Our projects don't have 23 partners. So. Sorry.
We don't have 23 partners either, so far.
I think 23 might be an outlier, that number. But
maybe that was a high one.
But we are seeing that there are multiple types of partnering going on.
Yeah, and it's also where does in the chain of all the pieces that go together, what's the IoT part and what's all the rest of the part, right? Because everything is a connection to something real that actually does something. And where does one start and end? If you say the sensor, that's probably the easiest place. Of course, we've been partnering with different people on different kinds of sensors for years, but those were there. The trick was to collect that real time, and which, by the way, wasn't particularly easy, because when all this stuff was put out there, none of it was developed with the idea that you would try to collect it all into one data store. It doesn't match, or actually it matches too well. Every machine is exactly identical to the other one, right? So how do you put it all in there and know which one was which? But so the big understanding on our side was that the scale and the need of a cloud partner to get all this across was clear. The tricky thing with there, and this is not Microsoft specifically, was we have to. Nothing came out of the box ready just to plug in and it works. You have to develop stuff. And now, who owns the stuff that you're developing? Because partnering, and in the true sense, this is what we did. We went in and said, "Hey, we need to do this together to figure out what the solution is." So now they're developing and we're developing, and one of the biggest struggles we've had, and we're still not completely finished with, is so who really owns what we're creating all the way through? That's a question. What have we done to deal with that? Is we said it just has to be solved. So let's keep moving. So there's a bit of a trust going on that some of these things that our legal office is not finished with, we want to push on, because if we don't move, we're not going to get there.
Yeah, we've heard a lot about issues around IP sharing, as well as also the data sharing, too, around who owns the data that's flowing through what you're creating, and who has maybe not even the ownership rights, but the monetization rights of that data, and working on that. So. Michael, you have good solutions for any of these challenges?
Yeah, I think one of the huge challenges is that really IoT coming now into the industrial world is that IoT technology 2-3 years ago was not enterprise ready yet. That is the number one. So you somehow have to go with one of the big ones, but usually they also don't innovate fast enough, right? Because IoT, just give you one example, this is edge computing. If you're connecting millions of devices, there is no way that you do machine learning, other things exclusively in the cloud. No way about that, right? So you have to have edge computing. Extremely new. There is just a very, very few out in the market who are starting to develop it, usually startups. So you need to have a partner who is innovating fast, who is aggressive in innovating by acquisitions. I think that is one of the major plays, and the more you mature, the more important is that you start to consolidate also your technology ones. And I think the huge challenge is, which is totally underestimated in the IoT journey, is the technology side, right? There is much more complex things like the business model behind how to deal with data for organizations. Usually we are not at all familiar with that, but even the technology is not simple. And because we always used to say technology is easy, that's not the problem anymore. IoT is extremely complex because you have the physical world, you have embedded systems, you have the enterprise IT, which is now all of a sudden being challenged by concepts coming over from the consumer internet, right? Big data and all of that is not really enterprise ready to some extent. So that's really where a strong partner comes into play. But in the beginning, you might be a little bit disappointed because he's not able to offer end-to-end. So it's important that he's fully committed to go this IoT journey end-to-end in a very, very fast pace and doing acquisitions for you. You just by yourself can't do it. And that's totally against your normal approach, because industrial companies for 100 years like ours, we were used to develop stuff by ourselves, to protect it, intellectual property. Now all of a sudden partnering with people, giving them the data, and so on. So that's a huge challenge in itself. So it's really important. You need to have partners, but few, and then with the right innovation pace.
I have a comment on that. I mean, for us, it's relatively straightforward. We have, again, an application platform that you can develop these applications on. Our customers put the data in the data stores or federate the data. The data are owned by them. Algorithms that they develop on the platform, they own. Applications they develop on the platform, they own. So that the IP is actually pretty clear and straightforward.
Yeah. I have a security question. The other big animal in the room, or elephant in the room, I guess, which is an animal. So it's interesting, when we asked organizations how well they were resolving issues with IoT, the best most organizations could offer is solutions that are acceptable for now regarding things like security. Truly, it seems like there was farther to go in terms of creating even better solutions around security. But we even found that you could predict whether a firm launched or not with IoT based on how they were responding to their ability to resolve concerns around security. So what's going on with security? How have you two addressed those types of concerns, and what are you all have found in the clients that you're working with to make sure that these systems really are ones that are viable and sustainable? Who wants to start with that one? You want to take that, Ed?
I mean, happy to jump in. I mean, we've worked with government organizations and linked out to their facilities and sensors, et cetera. So these are, I would say, the most concerned about security and deployed, in over 100 countries, basically. So,
are these closed network situations?
Well, they're into the cloud. They're into a AWS Gov Cloud specifically. Mm-hmm. So we've dealt with those types of situations where you're securing the endpoints through IPsec and other security mechanisms, and then you're basically securing the cloud piece of it using to standards like FedRAMP in the government, for HIPAA in healthcare, and these might require cloud, dedicated cloud instances, and then from there you basically secure the application platform and the application itself through the various standards and security standards. So, I would say that we have dealt with those instances, and it's not one of these things where you just leave it to happenstance.
Right. So, Jim, are you seeing patterns in addressing this?
Yeah. I mean, we've seen people, in some cases, go into implementation assuming the internet would be good enough, and then some unprotected UPnP-enabled device gets hijacked, like all the DDoS attacks I think probably everybody's familiar with, and then the wheels come off. one of the ways to deal that we try to do is to make sure that, one, that there are answers for that. So we have an ecosystem, in our campuses, you'll find security as a service vendors. And we will attach them to our Exchange products such that traffic can be scrubbed before it's handed off to the private network. So now that's an after the fact, kind of way of dealing with a problem, but it's something you should probably do just from a best practices perspective. Then the other side of that is on the industrial side, in many cases, you can actually avoid the internet. All of the major cloud providers do direct connect services. However, partly because the cloud providers themselves, it's new to them. It wasn't necessarily the way they originally built their products. And their partners don't necessarily think about that. So we spend a lot of time educating people on the fact that the ingress component can be secured as well. And so doing things like let's just avoid the public internet and the fact that these devices can be hijacked in the first place. Now that's not going to work for certain consumer cases, but in the industrial sense it can be softened. But we try to our job is to really, the way we look at it is I need to find the right structural ways of building the right ecosystem partners and the right physical infrastructure so that you're as private as you can be, and there's nothing more private than a private piece of glass between me and my service provider. That's about as good as it gets.
Yeah. Do one of you, Marc or Michael, want to take that? I'm just curious if this is a concern of yours regarding yours.
Absolutely. This was one of our super serious concerns, and I'm personally very much persuaded that this will be one of the biggest challenges of the industrial internet, because think about all these 50 billion machines, units, whatsoever, old coffee machines, other equipments, elevators, escalators get connected. They have been designed decades ago. They have never been designed to be connected to the internet. So we should all not be naive. There will be huge challenges, and cybersecurity will be a huge topic. So you have to be prepared when you go onto an IoT journey to take a lot of money into your hands and get prepared for that. Of course, you buy the solutions that the cloud gets secure and so on, and then you have to upgrade your embedded systems and so on. But it's really important that you are prepared for the case that it happens and have to build up the structures, global control centers, et cetera, and just don't be naive. Make that part of your IoT initiative from day one. Communicate that clearly with the stakeholders and also with your customers, and just get prepared for it, right? This will be the biggest challenge of the industrial internet in the next 5 years. Again, I'm quite sure about that, because not every coffee machine was designed for it.
Right.
Well, you must have the same as we, right? You had a huge installed base before you connected, right? And you sold those elevators to somebody, so it's in their environment, not your environment.
Yeah,
right?
Well, we have the service contract we maintain.
But okay, but internet was not part of the original service contract, right? So now you're going into somebody else's environment as well with all of what is happening there. You have a contract, so now you have to try to go in, and guess what? They all don't look the same, right? So you have to deal with that side of it as well. So yeah, this is. I think we have a bit the same stance. We're trying to do everything we can do. Oh, by the way, ours was not set up in the beginning by the IT organization who has a service business, an IT servicing type of mentality, right? This was an engineering department setting up stuff and connecting it and then leaving it to the customer management guys to, worry about. So when we got in, that was the first thing was like, oh my God, there's no security on any of this stuff. That kind of a reaction. So we've been doing quite a bit of retrofitting to make sure that this was going to be okay. And then we better be ready for the rainy day, because likely it will be somewhere.
Yeah, that's so interesting you mentioned that. We have seen this in some of the other industrial organizations that we've looked at, where the operations talent just wasn't digitally savvy, or the engineering talent wasn't as digitally savvy. And so risks like cyber emerged because you didn't have that understanding of what was going on as we start connecting devices. So this is actually something that was recurring, that was coming out of some of the cases that we did. Now, I know, Frank, we have some questions from the audience. If you would like to share, that'd be great.
Sure. So you all successfully anticipated the top question from the audience so far about IoT security. The follow-on question for you all are about standards for connecting things. So as the IT organization discovers that engineering has connected all these things, what are the standards you're imposing and how does that go? And then I think there's a follow-up question I'd ask you guys to address. And by the way, for the audience, we've got about 15 minutes, so fire in the questions and let's get the panel working at it. And the follow-up question is, how do you develop and maintain customer trust, not just for internal operations, but particularly in the case of Tetrapack, when you're putting the sensors in their location and collecting information about their operations? So standards and customer trust.
Okay, who wants to take standards?
I'll take trust if you take standards. Yeah, I mean, I will say the first part of it, as I indicated before, one of the issues was that the original setup was you sold a machine that included sensors for local monitoring of what was in there. It was an afterthought to say, and what about connecting that in and then bringing it back in? So the standard was a development standard from that side as opposed to security and connectivity and these parts. So security and connectivity and rolling that back through is an effort that's ongoing now to so that we can manage in this environment. When it comes to the ownership of the data on our side of it, in new contracts it's quite clear. In old contracts, again because of the installed base, it's not so clear because we weren't going to be collecting this. So one of the key things is deliver value to your customer, and it will be much easier to have the data conversation. You need to have some value out there that makes it interesting to have the discussion. If you don't have that, then don't ask them the question yet. Because why would they give it to you otherwise?
Yeah.
Okay, so standardization is usually not a good word, right? It just says you're becoming agile and so on. But it's super important that the industrial internet, and there is some efforts going on, and the large IoT providers are all jumping onto that. So there's a kind of IoT reference architecture being established, right? But we are certainly in the early days. And I'm not talking now about standard protocols like MQTT or that you have Cloud Foundry and so on. So that is becoming more and more mature. But the biggest challenge for companies like us and same like Tetrapack is a huge installed base where you have all these legacy embedded systems in place. And that's where you just need to have a way on finding connectivity, and that is usually quite proprietary. And that's a huge shift, right? And there is no easy formula to that. You just have to be prepared in order to go there. Other than that, standardization in the IoT world is a necessity because you want to be a major player in the ecosystem. And what comes here with standardization, and again, that's a huge transformational challenge, is with standardization to open your own internal architecture, to open your product architecture, to open your IP towards ecosystem and so on. So that's usually the biggest challenge associated with standardization in this regard.
Yeah. I'd love to go soft on you all if I can. So we've been talking a lot of tech types of topics. But what we saw in our study is that change has to happen for value to result from these efforts. And we all know how hard that is, especially for large organizations. So any thoughts on how you've been able to drive change that's necessary to get the actual lift from the IoT efforts that are in place? I mean, you mentioned showing the value with customers, so I'm sure once there is an understanding of what can be, then that must make it a little bit easier. But before that, what are your thoughts on?
With the customer, it's I'm going to offer you value. And in our case, one of the easiest ways is to say, we'll offer you value, and then we would like to share in the outcome. Nothing to lose. Right? So that one's a bit easier because that's a transaction. Internal change is tougher. We have an engineering department that built the machines that they could monitor, that if they had the data would know how to do things. And this was an engineering activity and an engineering-driven item. But then when connectivity and data comes into it, suddenly the IT resources are interested. But we didn't work the way that they do, and our portfolio wasn't prioritized the way that theirs was. And what we have to have when it's complete is different than what they're. So there was this big, the big culture shock comes in the R&D department meeting the IT service department. And what we ultimately did was basically said, okay, forget all that and let this group of people that we need, that 1 from this and 2 from this and 3 from here, and you guys go work while we try to figure out how we're going to do this, because we can't stop where we're going. We know you're breaking all the rules, that's okay. So we kind of had to like a lot. And what I see now, 2 years into it, is trust is built on relationships. Now they have worked together. Now there's trust. Now suddenly we can talk about common processes and budgets and planning and all these things. But until you get to that relationship that you can then put trust on, it's very hard to have that conversation. So get a group together and let them go do it, even if they're breaking the current rules. And then they'll help you figure out what the rules should be, as my learning.
I think the other comment I'd have is really reinforcing that, which is the change management for the people, let's say, in the field, so internally. And just because you have a machine learning classifier or AI system assigning a risk score for failure or theft, it doesn't mean that that operator or that investigator is actually going to believe it. And so there's huge change management associated with building trust and confidence around these AI-based systems, and then basically changing finding the right incentives to get them to actually deliver on the business results you're looking to do that. So I wouldn't underestimate. I think the technology piece is actually well understood, and it's really the change management that's the hard part.
So Michael,
If I can just add
yeah,
one.
absolutely.
I just thought of a really great story, still from a very large American oil company, because we're doing exactly the same thing. They brought in all of this data in the sense, and they put them all up on big screens in a big monitoring room. And then they tried to call the hands out there on the rigs and tell them what was wrong. Of course, they just hung up the phone. And it's like a 20-year-old kid calls me on the phone and stalking data or whatever. So what they did is and we're going to do the same thing. Bring a 20-year field service engineer guy into the center, and when the kid figures out what's going on, because he's the only one who can figure it out, he tells the 20-year man, and the 20-year man calls up the guy and says, "You got a problem." And they listen, and then you get going. But again, it's that trust cycle.
Yeah.
So yeah, you have to trick.
Yep.
Yeah. No, Michael, I was going to ask if you changed your metrics and incentives in any way, because you all did some redesign, for instance, with your service techs and such. Did you have any kind of special secret sauce to your change management efforts to drive that forward?
Yeah, well, I think we have now heard at the panel, and most of you are familiar with that IoT is a huge undertaking, huge challenge in all of the different dimensions. As we heard, technology, learning to deal with data, developing ecosystem, and also to develop a business model. So I think we are clear on that. And I think what was critical for us was really because in IoT projects, you really have to bring together the different silos. So we call it unity of effort. It's not just something which can be from R&D, IT, or from a product line. So it's really this unity of effort where you have to bring together the people. And ultimately, because it's fundamentally changing your business model if you want to go beyond pilot phases, right? You very often see IoT projects are started within a silo, within R&D or within IT, and then they're very successful with the first pilot, but when they want to scale and want to monetize on it, they usually fail. So it's really a business model undertaken, so you need to have this super sponsor. And you guys always hear about the role model, Jeff Immelt in GE. In our case, it was our chairman who was driving it and really buying into it, understanding the business model, the business opportunities behind of it, and then putting together this unity of effort team, so the necessary magnitude of resources and also the magnitude of investment. And I think this is just important. Otherwise, you will not change the DNA of the R&D folks with internal IP protection, behavior of the other things. And then what comes along with it is certainly that you also start to change your how you measure the success, right? So we ultimately said our IoT initiative is successful if we grow the top line and if we are profitable with that. And that's ultimately how we nowadays measure it.
Yeah. Frank, I saw you were up here before. I apologize. Do we have another question that you wanted to?
Yeah, sure. And we just have a couple more minutes to go here. So one of the things that happens with the Internet of Things, you start out thinking, as I think there was some discussion here, that you can phone all the data into the cloud. And that's sort of the setup to this question. Can you explain how you think about edge computing? How important is it? So, in fact, how distributed is the software, the hardware? And there were some underlying questions from some people in the audience, even like, what is that device out there? Is it really just a sensor? Is there a little computer? So a quick notion about how easy or difficult this is to make it work.
Okay. You want to take that? Start?
Happy to start. Yeah, I think the idea is that there is some computation that occurs in the cloud, and then there's computation that occurs in gateways, and then there's computations that occur really on the edge devices. And these edge devices do have processors on them. They do have memory. So over time, basically, they'll be quite powerful devices where you can actually deploy software and kernels or microkernels. And kind of our approach to this is that you can actually define your logic centrally, and actually, depending on where it's executing, whether it's executing in the cloud where it has access to more data, or on a gateway where it has access to a collection of data, or whether it's really at the edge where it has very little access to any other data, it can basically adjust that algorithm or the machine learning algorithm to essentially do the right thing. So it kind of redacts as it goes to the lowest edge. But really, there are computers, and it's just like running in the data center. You're running logic on the edge, and you're filtering, looking at images, for example, looking for significant events that you're then sending back up to the next level, to the next level. So it's kind of a flexible cloud infrastructure.
Great.
Yeah.
And I think we are out of time.
Well, and the audience's indulgence, I think we should let the others answer that one quickly and then wrap up.
Okay, sounds great. Jim, you want to add to that?
We see this a lot, we've gone about it in a few different ways. One is, partly the cloud providers themselves realize this is an issue because they realize that there needs to be some level of deduping or data cleansing that happens closer to the edge or closer to the devices, and or you have some sort of actuation requirement that has a relatively low latency requirement as part of it. And so they've rolled out gateway products, and we partner with them, and they'll essentially mention us in their reference architecture and say, okay, if this is a brand new project with essentially all brand new infrastructure, and you didn't already have a factory floor with a data room where to put this gateway stuff, you could come to Equinix and you could stick it in there and handle that. So we see it from that perspective. We also see it from the perspective that you do get a lot of legacy systems, SCADA-based, sorts of, where that's always been the architecture. And they have to accommodate, going from these older deployed systems to newer deployed systems, and how do you build the right tiers? And I think Ed was absolutely right. Usually you see device-based, gateway-based, and then sort of these long cycle analytics. So that seems to be the predominant sort of deployment hierarchy in the market.
In closing, Marc and Michael, can I ask you to give a quick, short piece of advice that you wish someone had given you when you started on your IoT journey?
I'd say put a cross-functional team together early on and give them some room to get moving. That would have saved us time. We had to fight a lot before we did that, and then we started moving.
I think, again, coming back to these 4 layers, technology, data, business model, and also, I even forgot the fourth one that was, that was the ecosystem play. define for you what IoT means for you, because this is, to be also clear, a big buzzword. There is people who talk about machine learning a little bit on the cloud. IoT, others just connectivity. Define really what it is for you. Be prepared that if you want to really leverage it, it's a real magnitude of a project. It's maybe one of your biggest transformation you have undertaken. It's not a technology project, but technology is complex. And don't do it by yourself. That was, again, that was what we tried to do years ago, and we broke our fingers. We went through a learning curve, so we could also say it was good. But we really, to go at scale, and in terms of scalability and scope, you have to have very strong partners in place.
Wonderful. So partner, and I think our research would reinforce the clarity is important. Know what you want, and then you'll get what you ask for. But you need to drive ahead. So thank you very much for helping all of us move ahead in IoT. Please join me in welcoming the panel.
Thanks all for attending. Enjoy the rest of the day.